Hello, everyone. Christine Niles here. Very excited to welcome you to the first episode of my show, Forward Boldly. Many of you don't know this, but before I ever started at Church Militant, I actually had a podcast titled Forward Boldly. And then when I started working at Church Militant in 2014, of course, I had to put that aside. But now it's come full circle. 10 years later, a decade older, a decade wiser, I hope. And so I'm very excited to share this show with you, and I see this very much as a conversation with you. It's just me, unscripted, speaking from the heart on all the topics that I care the most about and that which matter to you. I'm also open to suggestions and feedback, so please write me at forwardboldly@churchmilitant.com. That's forwardboldly@churchmilitant.com. Send me tips, send me topic ideas that you'd like me to discuss, perhaps people that you'd like me to interview. On to our first item. CBS rang in the new year by featuring 90-year-old Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich. Now, Ehrlich is a man who has promoted mass sterilization for women. He promotes sex-selective abortions, which usually target girls. He has called the Catholic Church evil for opposing abortion and contraception, and he's compared having babies with throwing garbage in your neighbor's yard. Let's hear what Paul Ehrlich had to say to CBS anchor Scott Pelley.
I know there's no political will to do any of the things that I'm concerned with, which is exactly why I and the vast majority of my colleagues think we've had it, that the next few decades will be the end of the kind of civilization we're used to.
So Ehrlich's words may be familiar to many of you. Here he is, once again predicting some sort of world disaster, which is exactly what he predicted in 1968 in his very well-known book, Population Bomb. Here are the opening lines of Population Bomb. Let me quote it for you. It's very dramatic. Quote, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate." Those were just the opening lines. And you know what? Never happened. Never happened. Hundreds of millions of people did not starve to death. The world did not come to an end as he predicted. In fact, let me read off a few statistics. The world's death rate has actually fallen from 13% in the time period of 1965 to 1970 to 8% today. That is a nearly 40% reduction in the death rate. Famines have pretty much disappeared from the world scene outside of war zones. And listen to this fact. Every single person in the world, all 8 billion plus of us, can fit on a landmass the size of Texas with room for a house and a yard for each. You're not packed shoulder to shoulder. There's room for a house and a yard for each. Everyone in the entire world can fit on a landmass the size of Texas. The world produces more food now than it has ever produced in its history. In fact, we have more food now than people can actually consume. There are more trees now, there are more forests now than there were 100 years ago. There was more deforestation a century ago than there is today. The richest countries in the world tend to be the most populated, and the poorest countries in the world tend to be the least populated. Why is that? Why? Because humans are the most valuable commodities. Commodity is not really the right word because we're not commodities. You can't buy and sell people. But humans are the most valuable resource on the earth, on the planet. We are the ones who produce, we create, we contribute, and we help society. And that explains why the more populated countries tend to be the more prosperous, because people are the valuable resources. Now, Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb kind of went viral back in 1968. World leaders adopted his, dystopian vision of the future, that there's this impending world disaster coming, and the world is overpopulated, and something terrible is going to happen. The world's going to end unless we implement some, drastic measures. And so that's exactly what countries did around the world. Countries in South America, Central America, but the most notorious was China. China's one-child policy, which was officially rolled out in 1979. And it resulted in mass sterilizations, forced abortions, jail time, in some cases murder of children outside the womb. It prevented approximately 400 million births. It led to a massive sex imbalance between men and women. At this point, there are about 38 million more men than there are women in China, and that's not a good thing, because what it means is you have bachelors, you have lifelong bachelors, men who cannot find a wife and therefore cannot start a family. That results in human trafficking, human sex trafficking, because you're bringing women in from other countries. And as we know, a lot of human sex trafficking involves kidnapping. Absolutely horrible things. But returning to the forced abortions and sterilizations, this is not conspiracy theory. I mean, leftist outfits like NPR and New York Times have acknowledged this is what was taking place under the one-child policy regime. In fact, Stephen Mosher, who's a very well-known China expert, Catholic, a great person, we've interviewed him a number of times at Church Militant. He was the first social scientist allowed onto mainland China back in 1979. He was an atheist back then. He witnessed firsthand the horrors of implementation of the one-child policy. He saw women being forcibly removed from their homes, taken to a clinic, strapped down against their will on a bed, and then their babies forcibly aborted. And confronted with this evil, this horrific evil, he had to rethink his atheism. He had to rethink it. And that was actually what led him on the path eventually to his conversion to Catholicism. But, pictures have been released from China of these poor mothers after their forced abortions with their dead babies lying next to them on their hospital beds, not even covered, not even given the dignity of being covered, just lying there bloody. And the women themselves are forced to pay for their own aborted babies' burials. We've heard of horror stories of soldiers' guards being sent to rural homes in China where they find out that they've had more than one baby, and literally taking the extra baby, the unauthorized baby, and killing them right there on the spot, throwing them out in the field to die from exposure to the elements. And then we also have the epidemic of the forgotten girls of China. It's extremely sad. In China, in Chinese culture, boys are considered more valuable than girls. That's just how Chinese culture is. And so if you have an extra child and it's a choice between a boy and a girl, well, which one are you going to keep? You're going to keep the boy and you're going to give away the girl. And so many of these girls are abandoned. They're abandoned on the streets to die from starvation or exposure to the elements, or they're dropped off at orphanages. And so you have these orphanages throughout China that are populated entirely with forgotten girls. It was one of the most heartbreaking things that I've ever had to cover. And it was one of the great evils wrought by this notion that the world is overpopulated, thanks to Paul Ehrlich, in large part, in his utterly discredited book, Population Bomb. One of the countries that you can look to right now, which is suffering from this idea of overpopulation, is Japan. Japan is facing population implosion. It's facing collapse. This is a scary and very sad statistic. There are more adult diapers being sold in Japan right now than there are infant diapers. There are more adult diapers sold in Japan right now than infant diapers. A healthy ratio between the working adult population versus the retired population would be like 5-1. So for every one elderly retiree drawing off Social Security, you should have 5 working adults contributing to the economy, contributing to taxes, contributing to the Social Security system. In Japan, they have things called they're pet cafes, and they exist to help console the elderly population who didn't have any children. They go to these pet cafes so that they can get their daily dose of affection from pets. They don't have children to hug and to love and to turn to and show affection. And so they get that, what they need, because humans crave that affection. They go to these cafes where they can get pet animals. It's just so sad. Something else as well is a lot of people in Japan are choosing not to get married. They're choosing pornography over marriage. They're choosing pornography over actual relationships with living, breathing human beings. I mean, it's become a culture of more and more isolation. And if you think about it, this is exactly what Satan wants, isn't it? I mean, if he were to implement the perfect plan that was anti-God, everything that God is against, isn't that what he would want? He would want us to choose isolation over community. He would want us to choose empty physical gratification, self-gratification, over authentic relationships with actual human beings. He would want us to reject marriage in order to focus on self. It's different when you choose celibacy for the kingdom of God, because you're not choosing self. Really, you're choosing God, and you're choosing to sacrifice yourself for the other for the sake of their souls. That's not what's going on here. People are rejecting marriage because they're choosing self, to stay isolated, focused on self and pleasure, empty pleasure. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Real Estate for Life. If you're looking to buy or sell a home, maybe you're not happy with where you're living, you want to move to a more family-friendly area, please consider going to Real Estate for Life. I myself have used them twice, once to sell a home, another time to buy a home. And in both cases, the experience was excellent. They paired me with professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. And on top of it, I got to choose a pro-life charity where a cut of their commission would go to. And the realtor also shared my values. Real Estate for Life is a multinational corporation that pairs pro-life home seekers with realtors and professionals who share their values. When you buy a home or sell a home with Real Estate for Life, the agent gives a portion of their commission to the pro-life charity of your choice. So for instance, on a home worth $180,000, about $1,000 of that will go to the charity of your choice. And that's all without costing you a single penny. So connect to a pro-life realtor. Please go to realestateforlife.org. That is realestateforlife.org. You will not regret it. Now, love him or hate him, Elon Musk has always been right about the population collapse, about the impending population implosion. It's going to spell disaster for societies and for countries. He's absolutely right about that. In fact, he spoke about it recently in December. Let's take a look at that clip.
What do you think is the biggest threat to mankind right now?
I'd say the biggest threat right now is population collapse. The super low birth rate.
Really?
Yeah.
Over like nuclear war, natural
birth
disaster?
Don't we have an overpopulation problem?
No, we have an underpopulation problem.
Really?
Yeah.
Why do you
So
say that?
this is the most commonly misunderstood situation.
Yeah, they definitely push that we have a
Mhm.
overpopulation
Yeah, why is
problem.
that?
I don't know. It's just like, I think it's like, this is a holdover from like, I don't know, the 70s or something, you know? So there was a huge baby boom, like where people did have a ton of kids after World War II. But then the U.S. has actually the birth rate in the U.S. has been below replacement rate since like 71 or 72.
In the
Like
U.S., but
50
how
years.
about
50 years,
other
the U.S. has
countries,
been
though?
below replacement rate.
I know U.S., but how about other countries?
Well, like China's got a huge population collapse problem.
And he's absolutely right. He's been warning about that for years. And you can see, too, among the younger generation, they're still buying this myth of overpopulation, which needs to die. Harvard sociologist Mary Brinton lays it out very clearly. She said, quote, "An aging population will mean higher costs for the government, a shortage of pension and Social Security type funds, a shortage of people to care for the very aged, slow economic growth, and a shortage of young workers." It's common sense, really. You need to replace the number of people who are leaving the workforce. You need to be able to replace them with new people entering the workforce so that they can contribute to the economy. They can pay taxes. They can contribute to pensions and Social Security. Because once you're out of that, obviously you're drawing upon your pension, you're drawing upon Social Security. You can no longer contribute financially to the economy. And so you have to be able to replace that. And as fewer and fewer people are giving birth, the elderly population is growing and growing. You know, the base, it should look like this. It should be a wide base of young people and a narrower base of older people. But right now, it's being reversed. You've got a larger and larger population of elderly and a smaller and smaller base of young people. And before you know it, that entire edifice is going to topple. it's going to collapse. It's going to mean the collapse of society, collapse of economies, collapse of the nation, of the country. And this is what Elon Musk has been warning about. He's been right about this. He might be wrong about lots of other things, but he's been absolutely spot on, dead on right about this. And people should be very concerned. You don't have to be Catholic to be concerned about this. Now, there are spiritual and moral ramifications to depopulation, but as we're discussing now, there are economic, financial, and societal ramifications as well. So China began to realize that its one-child policy was actually having very deleterious consequences for its country. So in 2013, it started to relax its one-child policy. It made it a two-child policy. And then in 2021, it grew to a three-child policy. And this is, again, because China realized this forced population control is not having the great effects that we thought it would have. We need the Chinese to start making more babies, having more children. But the Chinese have become so accustomed to having small families that they continue to use contraception, continue to use abortion to limit their number of children. And so their fertility, their birth rate continues to drop, which, again, it's not good for the country. If people had just turned to God, and listened to him and trusted him, we wouldn't find ourselves in the mess that we are in today. Countries all over the world suffering from declining birth rates, facing economic problems, facing a growing elderly population, a shrinking working adult population, facing imminent economic collapse and demographic winter. And not just that, an epidemic of loneliness, an epidemic of isolation, people eschewing marriage in favor of self, choosing self, or pornography, or some other empty pleasures in the place of authentic human relationships. If only we had listened to God from the very beginning, we could have avoided so much, because at the end of the day, God wants us to flourish. He wants our authentic happiness, and it's only in his will that we can find that. If only our world leaders would understand that and follow that, how much happier would we be? How much happier would society be? How much would society flourish if we simply followed God's ways and God's will? I want to close this episode with just a reminder, in the midst of all the turmoil and the confusion and the darkness today, just remember something. You were born for such a time as this. You were not an accident. You're not a mistake. God willed you into existence at this place, at this time, at this moment in history specifically, to fight for the restoration of the good, the true, and the beautiful. That's your task. That's my task, to do battle for truth. That's why you're here, to be a light in this darkness, to bring that light to others. Remember, write me at forwardboldly@churchmilitant.com with your ideas, suggestions, feedback, tips, people you'd like to see on the show, topics you would like discussed. Thank you so much for listening. And in the words of St. Joan of Arc, in God's name, forward boldly.